Hello, and thank you for your interest in taking the time to listen. My name is Edward Joel Lee. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology here at Mercyhurst University. And I'm speaking with you right now from Erie, Pennsylvania, on lands that historically were occupied by Erie Indians, and of course the Seneca Nation nearby and many of their neighbors. These lands remain home to many of their descendants, but also, of course, many of the newcomers from across the world who've contributed to the diverse and rich cultural tapestry that makes up Erie, the city, today. Issues related to the topic of diversity are increasingly important in the world in which we currently live. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that there are a number of prominent discussions facing contemporary society that deal with and engage with race, culture, ethnicity, and policy implications. And as a term and concept, diversity is often frequently encountered in both academic and wider public discourse. However, despite such widespread usage, what frequently results is some imprecision or confusion in how the concept is used and understood. People use the term in different ways, in different contexts, and sometimes you see a great deal of confusion or conflation. For example, cultural diversity is often conflated with multicultural as one example. And this draws attention to important but subtle distinctions that exist between terms and concepts, in particular, the qualities and contexts that apply to diversity, namely, more specifically, diversity status as both a social condition and a demographic condition. And what I mean by this is that if we view diversity as a social condition and understand in that sense, it's meant to reflect interaction and relations within a social system, and is often taken to imply meanings involving moral commitment, positive social contract, and solidarity that lend themselves to a view of diversity as inherently good. And we can contrast that with the view of diversity as a demographic condition, right? If we think about diversity as a demographic state, then it says nothing about the nature of interaction. It says nothing about integration or the quality of social life. What it does is simply denote or identify a state of mixture, heterogeneity. So the significance of this is that it's necessary for us to understand diversity as a social condition, and to do so in order to effectively develop and implement wider policy, we have to think about at the same time how we might continue to improve our awareness of diversity as a demographic condition. So it's in the interest of raising awareness about the experiences of diverse Native American peoples in contemporary society that my goal in this brief talk is to provide you with some context relevant to issues that are impacting Native American peoples in today's society. But more specifically, some of the issues as they relate to topics in Pennsylvania and the educational system. So let's start with the visibility issue. Just last month, Savannah's Act was signed into law. It was a bill that requires the Department of Justice to strengthen training, coordination, and data sharing as pertains to cases of murdered or missing Native Americans. And this particular law was written to address the alarming number of cases involving Native women that have been a persistent problem in the United States and Canada, just alarming rates of murder of Native women in the US and Canada. The bill is named for Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, a member of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. In 2017, a group of kayakers found her body floating in a river near the North Dakota and Minnesota border. She was 22 years old and 8 months pregnant when she was murdered by a neighbor. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Native American and African American women, age 18 and over, are subject to some of the highest rates of homicide among all women ages 18 and over. And research from 2008 indicates that Native American women in some communities are killed at more than 10 times the national average. And the question comes up frequently, so why has a lot of this crime gone unreported or uninvestigated? Why is this the case? And the simple answer, in part, is that Native people in general tend to remain largely invisible in wider society today. And this is a fact that has implications beyond the horrific violence against women to a range of issues impacting contemporary Native Americans, and raises further questions about why this remains the case. Now seems more timely than ever to raise awareness of these issues, given both how invisible Indians are here in Pennsylvania generally, and how prominent discussions of diversity are in national discourse at the moment. For a bit of background, we can think about how multiple lines of anthropological scientific evidence affirm that Native Americans have been in the Americas at least 15,000 years, with some recent data suggesting this could eventually be pushed back closer to 20 to 26,000 years in the Americas. Indians are, simply put, some of the most culturally diverse populations on the planet. Linguistic and cultural diversity are not equivalent, but linguistic diversity can be a quick and easy way to get at the general extent or degree of magnitude of cultural diversity and be able to compare that among populations and regions. So in that frame, we can think about at contact, there were over 500 distinct tribes or social groups that spoke at least 300 mutually unintelligible languages in North America alone, and at least 2,000 dialects of those languages. We're talking about languages as dramatically different as English and Mandarin. That's a greater level of linguistic diversity per square mile outside of anywhere, just about anywhere on the planet, outside of Southeast Asia and Central Africa. Population-wise, obviously pre-contact population estimates are difficult to calculate for the obvious reason that we can't count people, and post-contact demographic decline was so dramatic. The most reasonable estimates that researchers agree upon of a contact period population estimate is around 6 million. So that would be sort of a momentary snapshot population of 6 million Native Americans at contact. And that puts the corresponding population of around 328 Americans in the United States today as being comprised of about 1.8% Native American. So just to give you a sense of proportions. Most scholars agree that of that total population at contact, again, around 6 million, some 80% died in the 200 years following as a result of warfare and disease. So a dramatic demographic crash. By 1900, few Indians were alive anywhere but lands reserved for them, and only after that time did populations slowly begin to recover. However, high mortality and perhaps ethnic outmigration to avoid stigma of being Indian likely have slowed recovery. So it's against this historical backdrop that we can think about the composition and status of contemporary Native Americans. Today, Indians make up about 1.7% of the United States population. So that's about 5.2 million Native Americans in total. That's inclusive of individuals who self-identify as Native American, as well as individuals who identify as mixed race. And population growth among Native Americans, according to census data, has increased significantly in the last 30 years by upwards of 25%. And it's now the case that in contrast to 1900, where few Indians were living anywhere but the reservation, now more Indians live off reservation than on reservation, really by a ratio of 66% to 33%. As of today, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, with about 230 in Alaska, and a couple hundred more that are actively seeking recognition or reaffirmation of their federal status. Federal recognition status is a unique thing, and it's important for tribes because it formally establishes a government-to-government relationship. Status as a sovereign entity carries with it significant privileges, including exemptions from state and local jurisdictions. Now, for tribes that don't have federal recognition, there are some tribes that have state-level recognition. There are, in fact, 63 tribes spread out across 11 states that have state recognition. State recognition acknowledges the historical and cultural contributions of these tribes, many of which are not or lack federal recognition status. And in some cases, state recognition confers benefits that might help the tribe qualify for federal or state support, and it authorizes the tribes to participate on state commissions that typically inform policy decisions that affect Native Americans. So it's important to be able to claim and have state recognition in the absence of federal recognition. There are 326 reservations in the United States. And this is significant because it means that not all of the country's recognized tribes have a reservation. Some tribes have more than one reservation, some share reservations, while others have none. Educationally, many Native American communities have their own tribal colleges. There are 32 of which that are fully accredited. 17% of Native American students today continue their education after high school, which is compared to an average of about 60% for the rest of the United States population. But most recently, literally just a few days ago, the American Council on Education recently published a 6-chapter supplement to its February 2019 report on race and ethnicity in higher education. And this provided some additional analysis of federal data to examine how education in the United States is serving or failing students of color. Now, the supplement contains a number of valuable insights, and in part, it's worth noting that it was executed explicitly to address the lack of data on Native American students in the original report itself, a report that was designed to focus on race and ethnicity in education in America. Specifically, the report supplement includes a look at students who attend tribal colleges and universities, and also looks at Native serving institutions, some institutions that have high proportions of Native American students. And one of the most significant observations that Native students, along with African American students, are among the most disadvantaged and challenged when it comes to repaying the student loan debt, and in fact, achieving any form of meaningful economic success after graduation. Another interesting observation comes from the fact that the report identifies an additional lack of diversity among college personnel that is in reality out of step with the growing demographic diversity of student bodies in America today. Nearly 73% of full-time and 71% of part-time college faculty members that were beginning in fall 2017 were racially white and in senior administrative positions. And the overall racial and ethnic composition did not reflect the diversity of students during the 2018 to 2019 academic year. So what do we pin a lot of these issues or problems on, aside from historical trauma and historical events and circumstances that have played out in a very disadvantaged, negative, harmful way for Native American groups? Well, at play is a key implicit bias, namely that people don't know what an Indian looks like, or their view of Indians almost entirely conforms with mascots, Hollywood portrayals and performances, and what little they may be told in elementary school. Indians today habitually deal with an imposed identity and an ethnicity constructed from others' experiences, rather than through a mutual exchange with cultural knowledge. This image that you have before you is my very quick selection of all of the sort of top Google hits when you search images for American Indian. It gives you a sense of what, in some ways, obviously the Google algorithm has selected, but also what generally people expect or seek when they start searching for images of Native Americans. The upshot, and somewhat illustrated by this, is that Indians are often told they don't look Indian or they don't look Indian enough. The legal system and the federal government need things spelled out in black and white. We get that. And it often has the downside of disregarding the complexities and ambiguities that make up social reality for human societies. That said, it makes sense for us to want to be real clear about how we distinguish between different types of forms of identification for Native Americans or Indians or American Indians. The terms are largely interchangeable. On the one hand, we can distinguish between self-identification and tribal identification. When we talk about self-identification, really what we're talking about is how you as an individual identify as to your social or cultural or racial ethnic identity. Now, since the 1990 census, the United States has allowed people to self-identify as to their ethnicity. And when this happened, there was a 38% jump in the number of Native Americans recorded in the US Census, at least compared to 1980. And the problem with this is that because people can self-identify, they can't be checked independently or verified in that sense. Tribal definitions vary greatly and can change, and may or may not correspond or be equivalent with how someone self-identifies. Of the 574 federally recognized tribes that are extant today, each tribe makes its own determination of tribal membership. Sometimes it's a measure of blood. Some tribes require being at least half of that tribe's blood on their mother's side. Others must be direct lineal descendants of tribal members. You can only be a member, an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe one at a time. So my being of Lakota and Muskogee or Creek ancestry means that I can only be enrolled with one of those tribes at once. Tribal members who are enrolled and recognized as citizens of their nation typically receive a CDIB card, which is a certificate degree of Indian blood card and paperwork that certifies, based on historical documents and genealogies, that you have this measure of Indian blood, and then also perhaps a corresponding enrollment card that serves as sort of your ID for the tribe or nation. The key here is proof. This is all about proving who your ancestors were. And Indians, particularly in federally recognized tribes, have to prove who they are. I don't know if anybody caught in the prior slide the text on the woman's shirt, but it's worth revisiting. If we think about it in terms of proof, it's worthwhile to consider and think about some of the problems with this notion of proof or evidence. If blood quantum or blood percentage is defined based on historical records, then it's a valid question to ask how and based on what those criteria were. And sometimes, really often, it was based on appearance, what census takers, missionaries, and Indian agents thought someone looked like, whether they looked like they were half or a quarter or full blood. Combined with the fact that these were assessments made on visual appearance, they were communicating oftentimes in the individual's second or even third or fourth language, that records have since been lost, compounds a lot of the issues with being able to authenticate or verify a lot of individuals who self-identify as Native American today. And that's a big concern, I appreciate, because ethnic fraud remains a problem, as there are non-Indians who seek to capitalize on Indian ethnicity, whether to receive tribal benefits, apply for scholarships, or something as mundane as selling crafts that they want to be able to put Indian made on, or perhaps they have a certain agenda or axe to grind. At a larger social or ethnic scale, tribal designations are often used for convenience, but the label or appellation nation is often preferred. Tribe has a somewhat outdated connotation, even in anthropology, that groups are highly partitioned and distributed across the landscape, and that they're poorly organized. It lacks some of the sophistication that goes along with the label nation. And so tribal nations, or Seneca Nation, or Oglala Lakota Nation, or Muskogee Creek Nation are the preferred labels because they, on the one hand, not only convey and connote a more sophisticated governmental structure, but more importantly, that key aspect of sovereignty, that government-to-government relationship that tribes have. Native Americans are an invisible population in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one of the few states that neither contains a reservation nor recognizes any Native group within its borders at the federal or state level. State officials, as well as the general public, often assert that there are no Native Americans in the state. Yet, according to the last U.S. Census, more than 18,000 Native Americans live in Pennsylvania, and a minimum of 11 different organizations represent them. As the late anthropologist Dr. David Minderhout and his colleague Andrea Franz note, this is ironic because Pennsylvania was one of the first places where Europeans came into contact with Native Americans. Pennsylvania culture heroes such as William Penn and Conrad Weiser are known in large part because of their interactions with Native peoples. Now, Native people in Pennsylvania generally fall into four broad categories. There are descendants of some of the Algonquian language-speaking groups, such as the Lenape or Delaware, and Susquehannock populations who were resident in the state at the time of contact. Second, we have Mohawk, Seneca, and others from the Six Nation or Iroquois that have long lived and visited and interacted and intermarried with other groups throughout Pennsylvania. A third group consists of descendants of Native groups that migrated to Pennsylvania in the 18th century. Pennsylvania was then a relative haven for Native Americans fleeing oppressive colonial policies elsewhere. So examples of these groups would be the Shawnee, the Tuscarora, the Nanticoke, and many others. And of course, finally, the last group would be Indians from other states who have migrated in more recent decades to Pennsylvania, what my mother called transplanted Indians like myself. Given the history of Pennsylvania, claims to Native American heritage are difficult to verify, and this leads to a lot of disagreements over authenticity and identity. So it's not surprising then that the biggest concern for Pennsylvania Indians is official state recognition. And again, it's about visibility and awareness. The problem of the invisible Indian is a frequent issue that arises in encounters with educators specific, but also the wider public more generally. The stereotype is based on this production of local, regional, and national narratives by the dominant American society in which Native Americans are erased from the story. They're erased from the narratives at a certain point. They're rendered invisible as people who exist in the present. And in addition to being excised from post-contact written histories, there are more insidious narratives that persist regionally that deny Indians' claims to their own past. For example, the long debunked myth about a mysterious race of mound builders spread across the Ohio River Valley. Purportedly, there was an advanced non-Indian race that was slaughtered by Native Americans prior to European colonization. In West Virginia, it's commonly thought that few Indians lived within the state's modern political boundaries because it was largely or solely a hunting ground. Out west, we had the enigmatic Anasazi, disappeared from their monumental cliff dwellings, or were perhaps they were really created by someone else. Frequently invoked were the advanced, more understandable from a Western mindset, civilizations of the Aztec. And so many of the cliff dwellings and ancient ruins and architectural remains out west are given names that suggest a South American or Mesoamerican origin. What these stories do is buttress this idea, this notion that was so attractive to early settlers that Indian savages really didn't have a claim to their traditional lands. Rather, they provided justification or excuse for racist policies and genocide, policies to remove Indians from their land. Most problematic, however, is when these types of narratives are replicated in the educational system. K through 12 teachers typically have little to no curricular material or training for presenting topics regarding American Indians or Native Americans. Typically, if they have any material, it's part of a large historical curriculum, which is often incomplete and rarely focuses on American Indian history into the 20th century. As Christy Poitras and John Norder remind us, our expertise as educators lies in the recognition that we are not experts, but learners as well. And a successful endeavor in working with Indians, as well as in any diverse public, begins with this fundamental understanding. So in classrooms and other settings that do not explicitly serve Native Americans, it's ultimately up to the teacher to commit themselves to a degree of cultural humility and inclusiveness. And that may be requisite for teaching about Native American issues, identities, narratives, and histories, or simply even engaging those issues. Now, of course, time and space are always operating against us. And for a lot of instructors and educators, it's not always possible. We're pulled in multiple directions, and we lack many opportunities for meaningful critical reflection. The demands of teaching, especially nowadays, leave little opportunity to develop and deploy new curricula and means of instruction. But that doesn't mean that there's not a path forward or that there are things that we can't do, no matter how small. Mercyhurst University, like many other small universities in states lacking recognized tribes, has additional challenges stemming from not having a large Native community and a lack of mentors. Presently, Mercyhurst has 25 students who self-identify as Native American or Native Alaskan. I think I may be the only Native American faculty member on campus. However, I'm definitely not the only one on campus who cares about issues that disproportionately affect Native Americans or other historically marginalized groups. So recognizing this, what I would urge one to do is both in kind acknowledging the importance of what you can do to improve the situation in your particular setting is take advantage of the resources that are out there. Be aware of an enduring reticence on the part of some Native communities to engage with researchers and to a lesser extent educators because of persistent stereotyping, objectification, and a legacy, a painful legacy of negative research impacts on Indigenous peoples. You can go out of your way to develop training opportunities, both to heighten your awareness and creatively engage diversity and context that are more specific to your own work. A lot of this comes down to increasing your own awareness and by extension, raising the awareness of others, taking advantage of the resources that are out there. increasing course offerings if you're in educational situations, short seminars or entire classes. Depending on what you're doing, your area of interest and expertise, heighten your awareness as Native American history and traditions and issues today impacts where you're working. Something as simple as an acknowledgement during the appropriate lecture. Ask yourself what you know or don't know about Native Americans in the frame of your own interest, teaching, and service. And once you start looking, it's hard not to find your own connection, whether it be noting in a dance class that the first American major prima ballerina was Osage woman Maria Talchi, or that Charles Curtis was the first Native American vice president. Lastly, we have what have become known more broadly as land acknowledgements. And again, this is a small act that can be profoundly meaningful for Native Americans in the community or in your classroom. And Chip Colwell has aptly written about them that land acknowledgements work because they reflect the start of action. They reflect a concrete step to bring forgotten histories into the present. Land acknowledgement is a recognition of truth, a kind of verbal memorial that we erect in honor of Indigenous peoples. Like a memorial, land acknowledgement pays respect to Indigenous peoples by recognizing where they came from and affirming who they are today. And like a memorial, land acknowledgement is an education, enlisting speakers and audiences to learn about a region's Indigenous history. If you're interested in exploring collaborative opportunities or want to talk about ways you might be able to develop relationships with communities, I'm happy to offer resources or just be a sounding board. Certainly, if you have questions or comments, please do reach out. Send us an email at elies@mercyhurst.edu. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you all remain safe and healthy.